Okay, so welcome to the next talk in the series of talks in the RACS network. Today we have Andrew Davis joining us. Andrew Davis is a philosopher, theologian, and scholar of world religions. He's the program director for the Center for Process Studies at Claremont School of Theology at Willamette University. He's a native of Northern California. He holds a BA in Philosophy and Theology, an MA in Interreligious Studies, and a Ph.D. in Religion and Process Philosophy from Claremont School of Theology. He's an educator and advocate of cross-cultural knowledge and religious literacy. His studies have led him to a variety of religious contexts and communities around the world, including India, Israel-Palestine, and Europe. He received the 2013 Award for Excellence in Biblical Studies, 2017 Fellowship with FASPE, Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics, and the 2020 Presidential Award for Academic Excellence. He was recently nominated and elected as a Fellow for the International Society of Science and Religion. He's a poet, aphorist, and author or editor of several books, a whole load of books. I won't list them all out, but I'll include them in the description below if you want to check them out. So I think we're in for a real treat with Andrew today. I don't think I have anything to add. So Andrew, over to you. Tell us a bit about yourself, and then maybe also talk about how you got in contact with the RACS network and the stuff that you've been doing before we met.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone who's joining us today into the broader RACS network. I must say I've only recently discovered the RACS network, and I did so by browsing some of the resources on the International Society for Science and Religion's website. And even so, I discovered it rather late because we had just finished at the Center for Process Studies, a really innovative conference. I see Ted Peters is here. He joined us at the conference, a number of others perhaps that some of you are familiar with. And the title of that event was Astrobiology, Exophilosophy, and Cosmic Religion. And so that event took place May 5 to 7 at Willamette University and was co-organized by the Center for Process Studies and the Whitehead Research Project. And in brief, the purpose of the event was to investigate, to explore the resources of process philosophy and theology to questions of astrobiological research. So the religious layers, the existential, philosophical, and some of the scientific layers of this discussion, which is only increasing, as many of you know. There's a question just here in the chat: what is process studies? Process studies broadly is that a mode of studying which is indebted to, at least in its modern form, the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead's name has become almost synonymous with process studies, although of course process style philosophies go all the way back in the tradition to Buddhist, to Chinese, to ancient Greek thought, certainly for the West. So the discussion or the conversation, the lecture I'd like to offer this morning is emerging from that original conference. It's going to be a re-presentation of that initial lecture. And I think, Richard, I'll share my screen here if that's possible to bring that up. And I hope you all can see this here. Okay. And it will help if some of you are familiar with the work of Whitehead. I don't know if you may be. If not, that's okay. I think some of this may be a little new for you, which is okay. We can discuss that afterward. It'll also help if you're familiar with the work of Stephen J. Dick. So Stephen Dick for many years has been a great advocate of the astrobiological discussion, the various dimensions, societally, religiously, theologically, of that discussion. And Steve Dick was at the conference. I had the pleasure of engaging his work and getting to know him. And in particular, Steve, since all the way back, it's been about 20 years since he introduced the term of a naturalistic cosmotheology. And this term of cosmotheology originated with Immanuel Kant, but Dick started to include it in his work as a way of thinking about how it is that theology and religion might need to change in light of the impact of discovering life on other worlds. So my presentation here is titled From Negation to Exemplification, a Deeper Whiteheadian Cosmotheology. So I'm going to bring Whitehead and Dick together in thinking about critiquing in part Dick's cosmotheology on the basis of Whiteheadian metaphysical principles. So if you're unfamiliar with Dick's cosmotheology, let me just briefly give you a crash course in some of his assumptions and how he expresses cosmotheology. So what for Dick is cosmotheology? Well, as he defines it, cosmotheology is simply any theology, a theology that takes into account what we know about the universe as based on science. Now, this implicates Dick in a certain way, because what he assumes this involves is a rejection both of anthropocentrism and supernaturalism. Okay, so human beings are relegated essentially to this cosmological periphery, and for Dick, there really is nothing beyond the natural world, nothing supernatural, as it were. Put differently, cosmotheology for Dick affirms scientific, and if it must, a religious naturalism. So he's going to deny that there is any ontologically distinct or superior realm, including God, the solar heaven, and really for him, a creative evolutionary cosmos that lacks God, that is devoid of God, suffices really to inspire the reverence, the awe, the meaning, even the revelation that's traditionally been assigned to the religious sphere. And I include here cosmotheology or cosmophilosophy with a question mark, because this is a question that Dick himself has raised, whether his proposal should be considered under the label of cosmotheology or cosmophilosophy. We can get into that as we move along. Now, one of the more interesting dimensions of Dick's cosmotheology is that it favors, although it does not necessitate, what he calls the superintelligence hypothesis. Okay, and this is the hypothesis that there is a naturally evolved pseudo-divine intelligence. It may have attributes of omniscience, omnipotence. It may perform the functions traditionally assigned to God. But the key claim for Dick is that it's natural as opposed to supernatural. And what this means for him is that it is an advanced product of cosmological evolution. Okay. So if this is the crash course in some of Dick's assumptions with respect to cosmotheology, let me now point to my aim, my method, and what will be my result, hopefully, in thinking about thinking with Dick. So my aim is going to be to demonstrate how this arguably laudable project can be substantially deepened through when inversely approached through Whitehead's organic metaphysics. And so what do I mean by the language of inversely approach? Well, I'm essentially speaking to my method. Okay, my method is to metaphysically invert Dick's 6 principles of cosmotheology. I'm going to see what those are. And in doing this, I want to articulate how what I read to be certain cosmological and ontological negations at the heart of his principles can instead be read as metaphysical exemplifications. And this is important because I think this allows us to overcome some real problems, I would argue, that remain on Dick's proposal, but also allows for arguably the ontological reaffirmation of God, which I think is important for any true cosmotheology, if we're going to use that term. And my result will be then 6 alternative principles of a deeper Whiteheadian cosmotheology. Okay, arguably this will be a true cosmotheology that is deserving of the name, but it's going to be one that I would argue includes Dick's naturalistic intuitions, while also transcending some of the problems that I'm going to point to in his proposal, problems of conceptual problems, explanatory problems. Okay, so what are Dick's 6 principles of cosmotheology? And some of you may be familiar with these, but I want to point some elements out in them that perhaps have not been pointed out in the recent discussion. So notice that the first 3 principles of Dick's cosmotheology consist in what I'm calling negations, cosmological negations of human existence and experience. So notice humanity is not physically central to the universe. Humanity is not central biologically, mentally, or morally in the universe. And humanity is not at the top of the great chain of being in the universe. I should say that the third principle here I've slightly revised in terms of its phraseology. Dick usually states it in the following way, that humanity is likely near the bottom of the great chain of being. But to stay consistent with this element of negation I want to bring out, I've phrased it in this way: humanity is not at the top. Now, if these 3 principles consist in cosmological negations, the second 3 principles of Dick's cosmotheology then proceed to say what cosmotheology must affirm in light of these negations, in light of the rejection of anthropocentrism, and the rejection of supernaturalism. Okay, so 4, cosmotheology must be open to radically new and not supernatural conceptions of God. This for Dick will be a God that is grounded fundamentally in cosmic evolution. Cosmotheology must equally have a moral dimension, which we extend to embrace all species in the universe. For Dick, he conceives this as a reverence and respect for life in any form. And 6, cosmotheology must embrace the idea that human destiny should be linked to natural cosmic events and not to the divine. So these are the 6 principles I want to work with this morning in light of Whitehead's thinking. And I want to do so in the following way. We can actually express it in a couple different ways. So we're going to move from cosmological negation to metaphysical exemplification or substantiation. Put differently, I want to move from cosmological decentering to metaphysical recentering. From the negation of God ontologically to the affirmation of God ontologically, or put differently, what I call a move from Dick's cosmotheological anti-realism to Whitehead's cosmotheological realism. So in this way, we'll be moving from the insights of Dick as expressed in his cosmotheology to the deeper metaphysical base or substantiation that Whitehead offers. Okay, well, let's begin then looking at each of these inversions, as I'm going to call them. So Dick's first principle then states the following: okay, humanity is not physically central to the universe. Inverted, we might say that humanity exemplifies metaphysical principles that are utterly central to the universe. Now, for Dick, this first principle really follows upon these revolutionary compounding decenterings that happened in the development of our modern scientific understanding, from Copernicus to Shapley to Hubble. Of course, we know now that the Earth is not the center of a geocentric universe. It's a small part of a heliocentric solar system, the Milky Way galaxy itself being just a minute aspect of a much larger panoply of galaxies, each with billions of stars, with no conceivable end in sight. Okay, and we've seen that especially in the recent photos. This is an older photo you will recognize from the deep Hubble field. We've seen the brilliant photos released recently through the Webb telescope, which have brought this again to bear on our psyches, if you want. But this claim that the Earth, that we are cosmologically peripheral in a very deep sense. Now, Whitehead, of course, affirmed this, saying the human race consists of a small group of animals, which for a small time has barely differentiated itself from the mass of animal life on a small planet circling around a small sun. The universe is vast. Put differently, any system of thought, he says, based on this Earth of ours is extremely limited in its conceptions, either theology or philosophy, and most of them have been. We know now that our Earth is an insignificant planet swirling around a second-rate sun in no very important part of the universe. The response to that knowledge of first-rate people, that's you all, talking together should be immeasurably larger than it is. So we see some agreement between Whitehead and Dick here. And yet they're going to diverge because for Whitehead, despite the utter contingencies of our cosmological existence, he nevertheless is going to insist that we are internally, metaphysically connected with everything that exists. There's a continuity there that relativizes impulsive claims about our cosmological location, our size, or our position. So for Whitehead, our existence and experience really do exemplify to some significant degree the same metaphysical depths that apply across vast grades of evolutionary complexity and intensity throughout nature. And that's an important deviation from Dick's first principle. So in terms of the core takeaway of this first inversion would be that the fact of our cosmological decentering, real as it is, should be balanced by the necessity of our metaphysical recentering as truly authentic expressions of nature. We too are an expression of the character of the world at its most fundamental levels. And Whitehead, in a poetic fashion, says, in being ourselves, we are more than ourselves, to know that our experience, dim and fragmentary as it is, yet sounds the utmost depths of reality. Whitehead always has some beautifully poetic lines. So the first principle of Dick's cosmotheology, I would suggest, is fully sound, it's affirmed, but on Whitehead's inversive reading, our cosmological periphery must be seen in light of the fact of our existence and our experience as being metaphysically exemplary. Okay, this connects us in a way that simple affirmations of the Copernican principle don't. Okay. All right. Our second inversion, we move from Dick's claim that humanity is not central biologically, mentally, or morally in the universe to the Whiteheadian claim that humanity exemplifies biological, mental, and moral antecedents that are metaphysically central to the universe. Now, Dick's second principle here is qualified in terms of probability. Of course, we don't know yet. We don't have definitive proof, as it were, that there are billions of other life forms. But there's a certain wisdom that can be applied based on the Copernican principle. And that's what Dick's does, right? So with planets, which we once thought were sparse, we're certainly wrong about that. So also with life, it seems likely that diversity is the coin of the realm. Now, for Whitehead, he draws some very important metaphysical connections between the planetary, the biological, the mental, and the moral. They're all connected here. He says, on a grand scale, our cosmology discloses a process of overpowering change from nebula to stars, from stars to planets, from inorganic matter to life, from life to reason and moral responsibility. What is more, with Dick, he has no qualms about insisting that diversity is the coin of the realm when it comes to our cosmic understanding. Notice he says the forces that are constantly playing in upon our minds and bodies are inconceivably innumerable. For instance, rays from some star millions of light years away from us, forces as fantastic as that, and the forms of life which may be lived on other stars millions of light years away and million hence could be infinite and admit every possibility the imagination could conceive. It's a wonderful, wonderful statement. So what then for Whitehead are the metaphysical antecedents to the biological, the mental, and the moral domains that Dick has brought to bear in the second principle? Well, Whitehead, if you know anything about Whitehead's work, he expresses essentially the antecedent, the metaphysical antecedent of the biological domain in terms of the category of organism. He calls this philosophy the philosophy of organism. And Whitehead accounts for the fact that the sciences in their various forms are converging upon a more organic conception of actuality. And here he says the field is now open for the introduction of some new doctrine of organism, which may take the place of the materialism with which science in the 17th century has saddled philosophy. So a philosophy of organic actuality is going to take the place for Whitehead of a vacuous actuality, a mechanistic, a materialistic universe. Okay, and he expresses the metaphysical antecedent of the mental domain in terms of creative experience. So for Whitehead, the organisms that populate his ontology are events of experience. He calls them actual entities or actual occasions. And he speaks of these as the final real things of which the world is made up. And what these events are creative firings of experience. Okay, so for him, they not only have a mental pull, an influence from the past, they also have a physical pull, which inherits from the past, but a mental pull, which anticipates and is an element of self-determination in their life. And for our purposes, the point I'd like to make is that this mental dimension for Whitehead, it belongs to nature as an ontological primitive. It goes all the way down in the natural world, what some have called Whitehead's pan-experientialism. And the metaphysical antecedent for Whitehead of the moral domain that Dick speaks of is expressed in terms of aesthetic attainment. So for Whitehead, aesthetic value is real. It is the widest and the most inclusive form of value that's applicable to the universe, and in highly evolved forms at the human level. This is what allows Whitehead to say that the moral order is merely certain aspects of the aesthetic order, essentially realized in human life. So organism, creative experience, aesthetic attainment, these are not domains that just belong in the human realm. They are metaphysical antecedents to the biological, the mental, and the moral aspects of human existence. So the core takeaways then of the second inversion would be that the fact that biological, mental, and moral realities have emerged through human beings as expressions of this ontology means that they cannot be limited to our expression. Okay, rather, for Whitehead, their metaphysical antecedents must be found across the natural order in various degrees of intensity. So I would suggest again that Dick's second principle is affirmed but it's metaphysically inverted or substantiated on Whitehead's reading. We can say that while particular human expressions of life, mind, and morality on our planet are certainly cosmologically peripheral, the more fundamental antecedents of evolutionary organism, creative experience, and aesthetic attainment for Whitehead are metaphysically central. Okay, if we move to our third inversion, Dick's third principle, we move from the claim that humanity is not at the top of the great chain of being in the universe to the claim that humanity exemplifies the same metaphysical principles that are expressed in various intensities throughout the great chain of being in the universe. Now, for Dick, this third principle is based on the likely fact that there are potentially billions of alien civilizations, intelligence, that have antedated what would really be our newborn species through billions of years of evolution, whether cosmic, biological, or cultural. And yet the very claim of a great chain of being is not just cosmologically significant, but metaphysically significant. It seems in part to cry out for metaphysical justification and raise some real questions. For example, how do we understand the connections among this chain? Or what do beings along this chain commonly presuppose? That seems to be a question of ontology, a question of metaphysics that needs to be posed. Now, what about Whitehead and the great chain of being? Well, we saw that he just called actual entities the final real things of which the world is made up. So in a very real sense, these actual entities, these firings of experience, these occasions of experience, really are at the ontological bottom of the great chain of being for Whitehead. And yet, because this chain of being is more fundamentally a chain of becoming, right? Becoming being more fundamental than being for Whitehead, for process philosophy generally. This means that this chain truly is infinite in its reach towards novel possibilities of being. So when it comes to us, the fact that, again, that we've evolved as bodies and minds as expressions of this ontology means something significant, namely that we are not at the ontological bottom of the great chain of being. I don't know about you, but that's rather encouraging. When I wake up in the morning, I remind myself I am not at the bottom of the great chain of being. So for Whitehead, as he states, the occasion of experience, which includes a human mentality, is an extreme instance at one end of the scale of those happenings which constitute nature. Okay, we're a part of the spectrum, the metaphysical spectrum of the natural world. And yet, intense as our expression may be of this spectrum, as it were, we still, for Whitehead too, might be near the bottom in this vast spectrum of being. And I say this in light of a recent discovery of a truly wonderful quote of Whitehead's that's recorded by Lucian Price in his book, Dialogues of Alfred North Whitehead. And notice what he says here. He says, I see no reason to suppose that the air about us and the heavenly spaces over us may not be peopled by intelligences or entities or forms of life as unintelligible to us as we are to the insects. In the scale of size, the difference between the insects and us is nothing to that between us and the heavenly bodies. And who knows? Perhaps the nebula are sentient entities, and what we can see of them are their bodies. This is not more inconceivable than that there may be insects who have acute minds, though their outlook would be narrower than ours. My point is that we are part of an infinite series, and since the series is infinite, we had better take account of that fact and admit into our thinking these infinite possibilities. It's an extraordinary statement in many ways. Let me just draw out a couple layers of significance within it. Okay, one would be Whitehead's attribution of pervasive intelligence, sentience, and forms of life and mind to everything in the cosmos. Okay, and this is going to be consistent with his organic ontology of creative experience, where despite any number of vast degrees of difference and complexity, these dimensions are never wholly absent from nature. Okay, it's an important, essential point for Whitehead's thinking. Okay, notice he also again includes human beings as a part of and not apart from this infinite chain of being. Okay, again, our experience being authentic expressions along this chain. Okay, he points to the fact that there are forms of experience that are far narrower than us, forms of experience below us, for example, the insects, but there are also reciprocally in principle, there's forms of experience that are above us. These are forms of experience that in principle will be far wider and vastly more inclusive than our own. Okay, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. And lastly, he points to the great chain of being as essentially also being a great chain of non-being in the form of infinite possibilities. So these possibilities are there for Whitehead. They're real. They're in the nature of things, and actually they're ontologically problematic. Okay, we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, a natural question rises for me, for Dick, for many of you perhaps, if we are somewhere near the bottom of this great chain of being, as it were, then what is it that lies above us? If we imaginatively ascend that great chain of being still higher, what do we end up with? What is it like? Well, both Whitehead and Dick allow for this possibility, right, of a highly evolved intelligence vastly beyond human beings. And yet the significance of Whitehead is that he, I think, metaphysically substantiates this claim in terms of primitive evolutionary intelligence. Whatever it is that we may discover or may come in contact with, they're not going to be utterly foreign metaphysically to us. The vastness may be one of degree in principle, but not utterly one of kind. Okay, kind of a tedious point there. Now, Stephen Dick is fully open to affirming God as a supremely wise and powerful, albeit again fully natural superintelligence. For him, again, what that means is that the superintelligence is a contingent product of cosmological evolution. And I think it's important to see that Whitehead, in principle, I think would affirm something along these lines, but it would not yet reach God. And that's going to be an important point that we'll get into in just a couple moments here. So, core takeaways of our third inversion. Okay, so Whitehead does affirm the reality of great chain of becoming or being. He affirms that humanity with Dick is not at the top, but he substantiates this chain metaphysically and not just cosmologically. Okay, he provides a way of thinking about a great cosmological chain with a metaphysical chain below it, as it were. So intelligence, sentience, mind, all of these metaphysically belong to the great chain of being or becoming, as do infinite possibilities of non-being. And for Whitehead, a vast superintelligence is a live option as well, I would trust. But it's categorically different from that of God. And this is going to separate Whitehead and Stephen Dick quite a bit. And we'll see this as we move into the fourth principle. All right, so the fourth inversion, we move from the claim of Dick that cosmotheology must be open to radically new and non-supernatural conceptions of God, a God grounded in cosmic evolution, to the claim that cosmotheology must be open to truly radical and non-supernatural conceptions of God, a God grounding and exemplifying the metaphysical conditions of cosmic evolution. Now, Dick's fourth principle, as I mentioned in the beginning, is the first of three subsequent affirmations about what cosmotheology must or should affirm. And yet I argue that rather than being truly radical in nature, truly affirmative theologically, Dick's cosmological negations now cross over into a kind of ontological negation of God in this fourth principle. And I say this because the radical, the non-supernatural God that he has in mind is a fully contingent superintelligence. In other words, this intelligence is an emergent outcome of evolution rather than its necessary condition. That's quite a difference from what Whitehead's going to affirm. It's quite a difference from any affirmation of God, certainly in the classical tradition as well. Notice, for example, Dick says the God of cosmotheology is a natural evolutionary product, potentially with many characteristics normally associated with God. Okay, I include here omnipotence and omniscience, for example, which he's mentioned. Dick even goes so far as to say that such advanced intelligence could have fine-tuned the physical constants, thus explaining the conundrum of the anthropic principle. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. So we mentioned, of course, omniscience, omnipotence, and Whiteheadians, process thinkers generally understand these attributes of God differently. But if we shelf those for the moment, there's one traditional divine attribute that on Dick's cosmotheology has been fully negated. And I would argue that in principle, no highly evolved superintelligence can ever have. And that is the attribute of necessary existence, metaphysical necessity. So in contrast to the entire sweep of classical theology, Dick's God remains only on this level of cosmological contingency. Now, I will argue that this comes at a cost, however, okay? And the reason for this is because Dick's proposal arguably suffers some real metaphysical problems surrounding possibility and necessity, questions of truth and meaning. And these are problems that have traditionally found remedy within the realms of philosophical theology. But they're problems I would suggest that don't commit you to traditional expressions of certain modes of philosophical theology. They're larger problems than just, say, the classical tradition as well. So in brief, what are some of these problems in Dick's naturalistic cosmotheology? One would be the problem of possibility. Consider some of these questions. Okay, what is the ontological nature, the character or function of possibilities with respect to cosmic evolution? How and where do necessary possibilities exist, and how are they made relevant to the world process? Okay, this for Whitehead was a really important question. I think it's a question for all of us who hold to a deeply evolutionary cosmos, where possibilities are being actualized that are not inherent in the past. So what's the relationship between possibility and a universe of evolution? Dick assumes this realm of possibility to be there as unproblematic, but that's not the case for Whitehead. There's also arguably problems of truth and meaning. So, for example, what accounts for the objectivity of the past as accomplished fact and thus as true in this ceaselessly becoming world? Put differently, what is it that might distinguish what was from what might have been? Okay, this too is a metaphysical question. And the question of meaning, do our actions have any permanent significance in a world of ceaseless flux? Okay, these are also questions that are haunting Whitehead in a deep and significant way. I'd point also to a problem of coherence with respect to Dick's statements about fine-tuning and the superintelligence hypothesis. And it seems quite simple to me that in order to fine-tune the cosmological constants, the superintelligence cannot itself be a product of their tuning. And yet this is precisely what Dick seems to want to hold on to in saying that the superintelligence, like everything else, is a product of cosmological evolution. It seems to me you can't hold both of these in the same sentence, and that something contradictory, or at least paradoxical, has been held in affirming this. So what do we do with these issues? Well, on Whitehead's premises, I argue that admitting metaphysical necessity and widening evolutionary contingency in the superintelligence is going to help Dick with these problems on his cosmotheology. So following Whitehead, if he were to admit metaphysical necessity in the form of what Whitehead calls the primordial nature of God, this would arguably help resolve metaphysical problems of possibility and value, problems of necessity that are in the nature of things, okay? If he were to widen evolutionary contingency in the form of what Whitehead calls the consequent nature of God, this would arguably allow him resources to resolve honest problems of truth and meaning that arise on his proposal. And not just his proposal, but any proposal that is wanting to make sense, metaphysical sense, of both truth and the question of ultimate meaning. And I'd argue that in including both necessity and contingency in the form of what Whitehead and process thinkers have called divine dipolarity, would allow the superintelligence to be not only the primordial actuality in virtue of which there can be definite limitations or fine-tuning among these infinite possibilities, right? Again, only a selection of these allowing for life. In part, we've come to understand that through our modern cosmological understanding. The cosmological constants seem absurdly fine-tuned or absurdly limited. But it would also allow, this element of contingency would allow us to say that God in part is an evolutionary outcome of these limitations in respect to an evolutionary cosmos. So I think there's room for necessity and contingency in the doctrine of God. This has been a very important argument, not just of Whitehead, but of subsequent process thinkers, Hartshorne as well. And I think this will help resolve some of these issues that Dick's proposal faces. Now, I have to ask for the group here and for Dick's cosmotheology, is Whitehead's God naturalistic? The reason this is an important question is because Dick stakes a lot of value on this claim of a naturalistic cosmotheology. I think it's important to say that the naturalism of Whitehead's cosmotheology is not that of Dick. It's not that of most forms of naturalism as they are used today. Whitehead famously states his form of theological naturalism in the following comment. He said, God is not to be treated as an exception to all metaphysical principles invoked to save their collapse. He is their chief exemplification. Okay, this is his statement of theological naturalism. Now, Dick's naturalism, as we saw, requires the ontological disappearance of God. Okay, again, such that God has been fully negated ontologically. And yet Whitehead's naturalism here engenders what I would say is the ontological reappearance and affirmation of God, albeit as the chief exemplification of the same metaphysical conditions that apply to the world. Even the same conditions that in a very dim way are expressed in human existence and human experience. So let's briefly look at the takeaways of inversion 4. One would be that the correlate to rejecting what Dick calls the standard supernatural God for Whitehead, for process thinkers, is not the ontological negation of God as such, okay? God for Whitehead is required and belongs because of his demand for consistency and coherence in relation to these problems that we mentioned, problems that for him really do arise, metaphysical problems for an evolutionary and for a processive cosmos. So in Whitehead's cosmotheology, both naturalism and theological realism are coupled into a vision of God that chiefly expresses, chiefly embodies the metaphysical conditions expressed in the world. And I include this point, which I think is important. Process philosophers will agree with Dick that we should reject a God of the gaps, and yet there's cosmological gaps, and then there's metaphysical gaps. And these metaphysical gaps are arguably what David Griffin has called God-shaped holes that I would say remain unplugged or unfilled on Dick's cosmotheological proposal. Okay, in version 5, we move from the claim that cosmotheology must have a moral dimension, extending to embrace all species in the universe, a reverence and respect for life in any form, to the claim that cosmotheology must provide the ontological basis and stimulus for ideals of moral reverence and respect in the nature of things. Now, Dick's 5th principle looks to the future with moral foresight, anticipates our discovery, our potential interaction with extraterrestrial life forms. And if that's the case, we need to have an ethical perspective. And of course, various perspectives in the conversation have been offered. Astroethics, certainly Ted Peters has done great work in this field. Cosmocentric ethics, I think of Mark Lupacella, but also astropolicy, or different contours of this discussion. And yet, when inversely approached, what arguably requires explanation is how it is that the moral dimension metaphysically belongs to the nature of things, and why it is that pursuing it is ultimately worthwhile. I think that's an important approach. So what, for example, is the metaphysical basis for objective moral facts or duties in the universe, such that we can avoid a cosmological moral relativism? I think that's an important thing to avoid. And I'd point you to principle 2. If you recall, Dick said that human beings are not morally central to the universe, and fair enough. But if human beings are not morally central, then neither is any other species on any other planet. So it raises this larger question as to whether there is what we might say is an ontologically real moral center in relation to which the universe evolves and unfolds. So I think you would agree with me. I hope that we should argue against and avoid cosmological holocaust, okay? But again, on what metaphysical grounds does one say that this cannot and should not happen, okay? In the absence of a more articulated metaphysics that Dick doesn't offer, okay, again, for me, for Whitehead, for process thinkers, it's not obvious where and how moral ideals and facts can exist in a naturalistic cosmotheology that's negated ontologically, the traditional theological center, which helped resolve these questions. But again, I want to emphasize that saying that doesn't, I'm not committing one to affirming traditional theology in that way, but just that there's a connection there that's not often appreciated when it comes to easy dismissals of the reality of God. So in part, Dick acknowledges this question of where and how by speaking of the problem of universals with respect to extraterrestrial communication. And candidates for universals, he lists mathematics, for example, science, evolution, but also ethics and aesthetics. And again, if there are objective ethical or aesthetic ideals in the nature of things, they are what they are, independent of what I or what anyone thinks about them. And if that's the case, it raises a larger question about how they fit into the soil of one's ontology. It's a metaphysical question. Now, Dick rejects what he calls the naturalistic fallacy. Of course, not just him. There's lots of discussion on the naturalistic fallacy. He says it's often stated that morality stems from theology and the existence of God, with the unfortunate implication that any non-believer has no basis for morality. Instead, he points to what he calls the supernaturalistic fallacy, which is essentially the idea that morality must come from supernatural sources. Okay, this for Dick is the supernaturalistic fallacy. Okay, and among a spectrum of options, what he and Mark Lupacella and others have called the strong cosmocentric ethic would hold that the cosmos itself confers meaning in some way and is the basis for a universal ethics that we should universally apply. And yet again, as to precisely how it is the cosmos can house these kinds of facts, let alone confer or inform a moral meaning from them, this for me, for our Whiteheadian tradition, requires deeper metaphysical treatment. So enter Whitehead then on this discussion. It's important to see that Whitehead does not commit what Dick calls the supernaturalistic fallacy, nor does he commit the naturalistic fallacy, because he's expressing his cosmotheology as at once non-supernaturalist and realist in nature. So we might say that in consonance with the supernaturalistic fallacy, Whitehead fully agrees that objective moral standards do not require any allegiance to a so-called supernatural deity. And yet, in consonance with this naturalistic fallacy, he does agree that such standards, aesthetic, ethical standards, cannot be nowhere in a universe of ceaseless becoming. They require a context, a subsistence, if you want to use a traditional language. So for Whitehead, I would say the naturalistic fallacy is valid to the extent that it points to the God-shaped metaphysical whole that surrounds moral facts and duties. And yet it's invalid to the extent that it fulfills or fills this whole with a supernatural God, thus falling into what Dick has called the supernaturalistic fallacy. Okay, just a few core takeaways then of our fifth inversion. The ethical, the moral dimensions of the fifth principle of Dick are affirmed, but again, they're justified or substantiated on Whitehead's grounds metaphysically. We can say that although no planet or species will ever be morally central or ethically central to the universe, in principle for Whiteheadian ontology, the universe does evolve in relation to this ontologically distinct divine center, which in principle would forbid the kind of holocaustal relations we've seen on our planet and hopefully not other planets. Okay, and to the extent I would say that we engage in these things, we're essentially running against the moral and the religious fabric of the universe. We're defacing, if you want, the divine ground of our being. And I include the language of religion here because I'm, at least for this presentation, understanding this religious intuition to be a desire to be essentially in harmony with the fundamental nature of reality as one conceives it. Okay, as Whitehead states here, we have no right to deface the value experience, which is the very essence of the universe. And finally, our last inversion, we move from Dick's claim that theology must embrace the idea that human destiny should be linked to natural cosmic events, not to the divine, to the Whiteheadian inspired claim that cosmotheology must embrace human destiny as inextricably linked to the destiny of the cosmos as an infinite evolutionary expression of the metaphysical conditions chiefly exemplified in the divine. Now, Dick's sixth and final principle is aiming to secure a meaningful destiny for human beings. He wants this to be grounded in cosmic evolution rather than any kind of supernatural teleology. He's very wary of the language of teleology. And despite some important resonances he's pointed to between cosmotheology and Teilhard de Chardin's work, he nevertheless has expressed this sixth principle over and against what he's called the supernatural teleology, this omega of Teilhard de Chardin. As a side note, I think it's the case that Teilhard scholars would not easily say that Teilhard affirms the kind of supernaturalism, for example, that Dick rejects. I think that's an important point. I think of my colleague and friend Elia Delio, who would certainly push back at that. But when it comes to Whitehead and Dick's intuitions here, Dick and Whitehead are going to come closer together. So this is a difference from Whitehead and Teilhard. The Center for Process Studies will have an event next year on Whitehead and Teilhard. But Whitehead too is going to reject, quoting Tennyson, one far off divine event to which the whole universe moves as a fallacious conception of the universe. So Dick and Whitehead are coming a little bit closer here. Now for Dick, in terms of cosmic destiny and meaning, there's essentially two scenarios for human beings. Okay, if we are alone in the universe, then Dick insists our purpose, our destiny is to steward our planet, but also to potentially colonize or nurture, create life elsewhere in the universe, okay? Alternatively, we may live in a biological universe. This is one in which life and intelligence is vast and pervasive. If this is the case for Dick, our destiny is to interact with this life in all of its myriad possibilities, okay? These possibilities that Whitehead talked about. So we saw that Dick's naturalistic cosmotheology is implicitly open, that one of these possibilities is our interaction with pseudo-divine superintelligence, again, as this product of cosmological evolution. And again, I think nothing bars Whitehead from making the same statement, but what is required for Whitehead is a metaphysically necessary superintelligence that is naturalistic, that is realistic, and that really ultimately belongs, I'd say, primordially to the nature of things, okay? Our last takeaways then. So for Whitehead, human destiny remains inextricably linked to cosmological evolution in a participatory way, and cosmological evolution remains inextricably linked to a participatory God that chiefly embodies these metaphysical conditions. These are conditions that render the universe possible, actual, and infinitely continuous. And we should say that up to this point, the process of cosmic evolution has involved a nonlinear, but nevertheless progressive intensification of these kinds of conditions. But there is for Whitehead no final end in sight. Right? There is no ultimate converging omega, if we're going to use that sort of language. In the final analysis, I would say that reaching for novel possibilities of beauty, okay, again, the origins of which are going to reside in this primordial mind of God as Whitehead conceives it, and actualizing these possibilities to the highest degree possible. This, on Whitehead's scheme, I think, constitutes a human purpose and cosmic destiny. To finally conclude us then, we've arrived at 6 alternative principles of a deeper Whiteheadian cosmotheology, and I'll just list these for you here. And I want to thank the RACS Network and thank you all for your attention, and also say that the content of this presentation is going to be published in the forthcoming volume, which captures a lot of the explorations and investigations that happened at the recent Astrobiology, Exophilosophy, and Cosmic Religion Conference. And I'll keep the network updated in that regard. We are arguing with publishers at the moment, but the book will be forthcoming, and I hope you'll take interest. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I have jotted down 1 or 2, but does anybody want to jump in first? Ted, you've got your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
I'd like to say a few things. Can you hear me satisfactorily? I'm about to have my electricity turned off by some construction workers. Say a few things and then ask Andrew a question. Number one, I'm really glad that we're taking a look at Stephen Dick's cosmotheology. He's a fine historian, and he's one of the first now to give us a carefully thought through naturalistic theory of cosmic theology. I do think, and I think this might have been principle number 5 in Andrew's presentation, that Dick's entire scheme is founded upon the naturalistic fallacy, and it's not going to work. Stephen is still within the Newtonian Cartesian understanding of the natural world, in which there is no value in nature. You cannot ask nature to provide value. And Stephen defends himself by attacking supernaturalism, but that's not a good defense. And that's where Andrew is absolutely right in invoking Whitehead, because Whitehead places the natural world within a metaphysical scheme in which value is already built in. And I think that's such an important move. And I am not a card-carrying Whiteheadian, but my heart is strangely warmed by this presentation, because I did study with the Chicago School for a while, and I just think Whitehead is one of the forgotten geniuses, really, of the 20th century in terms of these issues. Another way, I think, to make Andrew's argument would be to disqualify the Copernican principle, namely that we become unimportant simply because we're small. The whole Copernican principle is fallacious, but the cosmological principle is not, whereby all the laws of nature that we discern here on Earth apply also to those distant galaxies. And I think Andrew was very creative in bringing in the exemplification principle from Whitehead in order to demonstrate that we are not marginalized just because we're small. So I'm going to finish then with my question to Andrew. Do you think that that way of saying it, that the cosmological principle and the exemplification principle are the key then to separating your cosmotheology from Dick's cosmotheology?
Yeah, thanks, Ted, for those comments. And I would, Ted also has a great paper that'll be included in the volume, so I hope you all will read that. I think, Ted, that is one, it's one way to express that. Yeah, what I wanted to do in this, and of course the paper is much more detailed, and it plays off of Dick's paper, which will also be in the book. I wanted to add some metaphysical foundations to what I thought were important expressions in Dick's cosmotheology. Whitehead makes a distinction between the endeavor of cosmology and the endeavor of metaphysics. And the metaphysical endeavor in principle is deeper than that of cosmology. Cosmology involves our particular cosmic epoch, right? Ideas that are relevant to our particular world, but not to any and all possible world. And metaphysical insights deal with that element of necessity, those notions that are applicable to any and all possible worlds. Now, Dick recognizes questions of metaphysics, but he never quite endeavors them. So I think his insights of cosmotheology are largely cosmological in nature. But when you divorce cosmology from metaphysics, I think you're divorcing yourself from an important foundation that's going to help you resolve some problems if you only state things cosmologically, as it were. And I mean, the cosmology and metaphysics is a tedious distinction, and Dick has brought that up. But I wanted to push him to be more clear about his metaphysical foundations. Now, you mentioned he's a wonderful historian. He's not a philosopher or a metaphysician, but that's why I think multiple disciplines are important to bring to this discussion. And Dick and I are in consistent dialogue. So does that answer your question in part, Ted?
Yes. You know what? I'm thinking, in light of what you just said, that the word cosmology has two different meanings, not contradictory at all. On the one hand, the cosmological principle is a scientific principle which refers to the ubiquity of the laws of nature. Cosmology, then, in the Whiteheadian sense, refers to a speculative scheme about how you put things together. So we might want to just stipulate those two different meanings of cosmology as we proceed. At any rate,
That's helpful. Yeah, thank you, Ted. Other questions?
Shall I jump in next? I have
Please.
two for you, Andrew. One's like a sort of clarificatory question, then there's maybe a bit more of a challenging question. I guess just starting with the clarificatory question, I'm not a process theologian. I always find that when I listen to process theologians or read anything, I sort of following it, and then all of a sudden I completely lose it, and then it comes back in. So yes, but you were particularly clear. I found it very persuasive. But you mentioned this sort of creativity that is woven into the fabric of the universe at every level. And I think, did you describe that as pan-experientialism? Is that the term you used?
Well, I did use that term in reference to speaking about what for Whitehead I would say is the metaphysical antecedent to the claim of mind in the universe. So mind is not just a human domain. For Whitehead, I was saying it belongs primordially to nature. And the language of pan-experientialism, as phrased by David Griffin, is simply the claim that experience, a mental dimension, goes all the way down to the natural world. It's actually irreducible. There is no point in the natural world where mind fully disappears.
So is that
so that's pan-experientialism.
Is that similar to panpsychism?
Quite similar indeed. Some will use the language of panpsychism for Whitehead as well. Whitehead, in fact, didn't like that language. And I think part of the reason process thinkers have wanted to use pan-experientialism in distinction from panpsychism is sometimes the panpsychism discussion says that consciousness goes all the way down in nature. And that's not a claim that Whitehead is making. In fact, experience for him is more fundamental than consciousness. Consciousness, certainly in animal evolution and our evolution, is a highly evolved achievement, which presupposes more fundamental experiential base. So consciousness doesn't go down in nature, but experience does, hence the distinction between pan-experientialism and panpsychism. Of course, that discussion is much more tedious and complex than these statements, but that is important distinction, that experience and consciousness are distinct from each other on a Whiteheadian scheme.
I see. So
does that help?
Well, yeah, just sort of, yes, but it raises more questions. Does that mean he thinks that you can have experiences without anything being conscious of them? There's unconscious experiences.
Yes, yeah, that is something he would insist upon. I mean, in our human case, we have this, don't we? Like one example, if all of us are awake for roughly 16 hours and we sleep for 8 when we're unconscious, and if we were to suffer a heart attack, God forbid, our body experiences this. We experience it, but we do not experience it consciously. So I think the language of unconscious experience is applicable to Whitehead. All the way down in nature, he uses the language of not apprehension, which we have on our human level, but prehension, a grasping. It's an experiential feeling for Whitehead that runs all the way down in nature and is never wholly absent. So you can have experience without consciousness. Again, consciousness being, if you want, the crown of experience. Okay. So, and if you're interested further, anyone in that discussion, I'd point you to the work of David Ray Griffin, who's done a great work, Unsnarling the World Knot, which is his book of a number of years ago, where he takes on this question in the philosophy of mind, the mind-body problem, freedom, etc. An important contribution.
Perhaps that nicely leads me on to the sort of maybe more challenging thing, because if we exemplify consciousness, more generally, you said that humans, something along the lines of humans exemplify metaphysical principles that are absolutely essential to the universe. And I guess I wanted to, how can we exemplify them? We can manifest them. How can we exemplify them if there is this infinite chain of being, and we're potentially and quite possibly near the bottom? That surely exemplification is not the right term. Surely it should be sort of manifesting. So that's more of a challenging question.
Sure. Yeah, good question. I think we might squabble just on terminology. I mean, I don't think I would using the language of manifestation. And certainly there's no dogmatic claim surrounding the fact that we know precisely what these metaphysical principles are. We don't. Whitehead is very critical of those approaches that lay out clear and distinct principles and then let everything unfold from those easily. So, but the claim that we express the deepest nature of reality, if you want to put it that way, is rooted for him in the claim that we are not other than reality. We've not fallen into the world from somewhere else. We've grown out of it like a plant out of soil. And if that's the case, then observations and attention to our experience is going to give us clues into the metaphysical principles that extend beyond our experience. So it's a claim of continuity between human beings and nature that seems to be that there are going to be metaphysical principles of some kind, and that these are going to find expression in our lives, albeit dimly. So in my claim that we are not at the ontological bottom, that's an important claim. We might still be near the bottom, but in principle, if there are necessary metaphysical principles that are being expressed in cosmological forms, then they belong to everything that is, and human beings are a part of that. Now, the controversial claim for classical and traditional theology is Whitehead's claim that God is not an exception to metaphysical principles either, right? God uniquely embodies them rather than creates them. And that's a theological commitment that has to be made, right? It seems like there's only two options. Either God establishes the metaphysical situation and stands outside it, outside the world and us, or God chiefly embodies those metaphysical dimensions in God's own life. And that, I think, the trajectory of that changes things quite a bit. God is internally related to the world process. God is naturally, as it were, as opposed to supernaturally related to the world. So the language of manifestation, I think, is fine as well. God chiefly manifests. Human beings manifest to some degree the metaphysical dimensions of existence by virtue of existing. Does that help at all? I hope I'm adding clarity to that.
Yeah.
Of course, I realize. I'm sorry. I realize that a lot. If you're not familiar with some of the Whiteheadian lingo, we just jump in using it, and that's a besetting sin of process philosophers. So I'm trying to work on that. I'm writing an introduction to Whitehead's thought now, which hopes to be much more palatable to larger audiences, introductory philosophy students, etc. So, yeah, thank you, Richard, for those questions.
Thank you. Yeah. Emad, looks like you've got.
I think the way I've illustrated some of what you're saying is Arthur C. Clarke's novel, The Deep Range. You have this future world where they've cured world hunger by harvesting whales. And then the head of the Buddhist religion, Scotsman, who converts to Buddhism, he wants to ban whale hunting and these things. And they ask him why. We've solved world hunger, everything's great. So, he tells them this story. I think some play or something, parable from English literature, where man is put on trial in the afterlife, and animals are asked to give testimony in his favor. Only two animals only two animals do testimony in man's favor. One is the horse, the other is the flea. Flea because it lives off his blood. The horse because he's nice to man's best friend. So the scientist says, I don't understand what you mean. But supposing we encounter a superior alien life, how are they going to judge us? They're going to judge us based on the way we treat our inferiors, the animals, and more specifically the whales, who are practically our brethren because they're intelligent. And that causes a shock to the scientist guy, and he spent his whole career harvesting whales, thinking that this is the natural thing to do. And he finally sides with the Buddhist guy. That's one thing.
Thank you.
Related to this, I want to ask if Arthur C. Clarke was influenced by Whitehead, because he sounds almost exactly like him. In his novel Childhood's End, where these aliens help human beings evolve and become kind of spirit beings or energy beings. Arthur C. Clarke was an atheist, as I understand it, but he has this kind of very cosmological, spiritual arc.
Yeah, thanks, Imad. It's a little difficult to hear you, but I think you came through. To your last comment there, I'm actually not sure. That's a good question. That's worth looking into as to whether Clarke was influenced by Whitehead. I think it's important to say that, Whitehead too, for nearly 20 years was an agnostic or atheist. So Whitehead had, like most of us, a complicated religious and theological situation. And Whitehead's reason for bringing God in was not because of any religious agenda. Whitehead brought God in on this concern for rationality, for consistency. Like St. Augustine, of course. Yes, thanks, Imad. But God belongs because of the need to really address what Whitehead interprets to be some deep metaphysical problems for a processive universe. And it's that element that I think Dick has not included, but perhaps has done so. And I think it helps Dick. It would actually help him affirm a more robust cosmotheology, because God has not been negated. On Dick's account, I do think the language of cosmophilosophy is more appropriate, because God, as he conceives it, is just a placeholder for whatever brings meaning, right? And that's a reduction of what theology has been. So I think it's important to state that. I didn't quite hear what you said initially with respect to animals.
The Deep Range, Arthur C. Clarke, the novel, they cure world hunger by harvesting whales. Then the Buddhist Pope says we have to, the aliens will treat us based on how we treat our inferiors, the animals, and more specifically whales, because they're practically our brethren because they have intelligence. We should stop slaughtering them and become vegetarian. Something.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just a quick comment on the relevance of that statement. It's beautiful and haunting, right, in a deep way. I think that's the point of it. Process thinkers have utilized Whitehead's thought, certainly not just Whitehead's thought, to enter into discussions of animal ethics. I hope you all hear from Brianne Donaldson as well, who's done such wonderful work on animal ethics from a Whiteheadian and a Jain perspective, Jainism. So, but the discussions of deep ecology, of environmentalism, of our relationships to animals, to go back to Ted's comment, all of these assume that experience and value is not just restricted to human beings. The problem with saying that it is how on earth did it get there? This is the problem of how experience emerges, how value emerges. It doesn't just pop into existence at one place as it created fully by human beings, prior to which there was nothing. That I think creates some very difficult ontological questions that in part I'm trying to play with metaphysically. So thanks, Imad.
I also mentioned, in the comments, I talk about Eric Fromm and his bioethics. Anything that stifles growth is bad. Anything that encourages growth is good. We use biology to model ethics. Good idea?
Yes, sorry, Imad, I'm just struggling to hear you a little bit, but
Eric Fromm and his bioethics. Anything that stifles growth is bad. Anything that encourages growth is good.
I see. Yes, well, we could probably point to some issues with that as well, right? I think the claim that we're not morally or ethically central is an important one, but it applies to any other planet. So who has the jurisdiction to impose moral principles? We don't have to say that we know what these principles are, but we certainly assume a distinction between better and worse, between good and evil, if you want to use that language. People disagree about that distinction, but that distinction is real, I think I would be prepared to say universally assumed in human culture and human life. And that is, and I think an important dimension of Whiteheadian thinking is, I'll put it this way, whatever you inevitably presuppose and practice has to find a place in your metaphysics. Otherwise, you're being inconsistent, right? Anyhow, any other comments?
Yeah, I think we've maybe got time for one more. I guess there was one question that I saw Ted raised in the comments.
Oh yeah,
Ted, you pointed something out about how under this schema there would be certain respects in which your dog would come above you in the chain of being.
Well, yeah, that was at a particular point where Andrew was talking about rank, which leads me to a more general question for Andrew. Frequently, we talked about the great chain of being, and you can rank things there from the simple to the more complex, from the stupid to the intelligent, and etc. And I wonder, does that really fit very well with the Whiteheadian scheme to rank levels of being, so to speak?
Okay, yeah, that's a really great question, Ted. It makes sense when approached from the perspective that these levels of being involve different levels of aesthetic achievement. There's a value claim involved here. So as an example, David Griffin and other process thinkers have pushed back at the claim of deep ecologists that there is pure egalitarian equality of value when it comes to any and all forms of life. In principle, we saw your dog mentioned, the virus mentioned, the chat. In principle, any form of life and striving is at the same level. So process thinkers have not wanted to make that claim because they take reality, or that they take the claim that evolution involves achievements of value states very, very seriously, and higher value states. It's certainly the case that our dogs and our pets have aesthetic experience. They are themselves, Whitehead would say, an achievement of value in the universe. So are we, but we would think it wrong to degrade a human being to the level of a dog, for example, or a dog to the level of a rodent. And you can work your way down, as it were, based on those principles. So there's different hierarchies of value that are really there. And I think that's the perspective from which we make those kinds of claims. There was a claim about viruses, and their interesting work on decision-making bacteria, right? The experiential dimension of bacteria, that's also been published. And this, Richard, kind of goes back to your claim about pan-experientialism, where there's a certain evidentiary significance to a lot of this research now, where experience and creativity, elements of novelty, organic types of thinking are present very, very low, as it were, in nature. But the experience of a dog or a bacterium is going to be far less aesthetically intense than ours. And for that reason, we can speak of them as being not less valuable, but as a way of speaking in that way. Some have used that same language to argue for, discussions about veganism or vegetarianism, how we treat the natural world. Whitehead says life is robbery. And it's unfortunate that in our world, that is just how it goes. To live is to live off others in some way. But that doesn't mean that we use that statement unwisely. So anyhow, good question. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, I think let's wrap up there, and I'll stop recording. We'll say goodbye to our YouTube viewers. We can keep talking for a few minutes after if you want. But if you enjoyed Ted's comments, then Ted is our next speaker. He'll be speaking towards the end of August. So depending upon when you're watching this, YouTube viewer, if it's before then, send me an email at theracksnetwork@gmail.com, and I can give you an invite. And if it's after that, have a look at the videos and you'll find Ted Peters' talk. And again, I'll have uploaded this. I'll upload it before this one. Jeffrey Long was also part of that conference that Andrew was talking about. So he was talking about Hinduism and Jainism and that sort of thing. So have a look at his talk too if you found this interesting.
And Richard, the only thing I'd add is that we also have, I understand, who's presenting next, Matt Siegel and his colleague are going to be presenting on the hot spring hypothesis. I think down the line, potentially Chelsea Haramia, who joined us briefly, will also be presenting. These are excellent contributions to this discussion. So I hope the network will take interest.
I don't know how to pronounce this.
I'm sorry.
We got Matt, and then we've also got Chelsea Haramia. Is that how it's pronounced?
Haramia, I believe. Yeah, Matt and Bruce Damer will be excellent. I think the group will enjoy, and Chelsea Haramia's work is really fantastic on the question of whether or not we can share value, objective value, actually logical dimensions with extraterrestrials. So fun stuff for all.
Absolutely. Okay, well, YouTube viewer, this is goodbye, but don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. All right, take care.